So I will start introducing the panelists based on the order on my list of questions that I sent you, if you're okay with that. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to have all of you and my great panelists who are discussing the most recent events in Tunisia from a local perspective. And thank you for GLD for hosting this roundtable. I'd like to start by introducing my panelists. So my first panelist is Sarah Yerkes, and she's a senior fellow in the Carnegie Middle East program. Her research focuses on Tunisia's political, economic, security developments, as well as state-society relations in the Middle East and North Africa. I also have Mohamed-Dhia Hammami, who is a PhD candidate in the political science department at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. And he holds a BA from Wesleyan University in Government and College of Social Studies with a certificate in international relations. I also have Intissar Kherigi, who is a postdoctoral researcher in comparative political sociology at Sciences Po University in Paris, and her research focuses on policymaking processes and decentralization reforms in post-revolutionary Tunisia. She holds a Bachelor in Law from King's College, Cambridge University, and a Master's in Human Rights from the London Schools of Economics and Political Science. And I have also Lana Salman, who is a scholar of international development and urban protest politics, and she is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the Middle East Initiative, Harvard University. She holds a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of California, Berkeley, and her work focuses on local governance, democratizing politics, and role of international financial institutions in reconfiguring the cities of the global south. So I'd like to welcome all my panelists, and the moderator is me, Marwa Shalaby, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I focus on Middle East politics and gender politics. Okay, so let's start our discussion with a question to Sarah. So Sarah, what is going on? So we want to have, for those who has a little background on the Tunisian case and the recent developments in Tunisia. So can you give us a brief overview of the recent democratic backsliding in Tunisia? In what ways you think it has impacted the local governance units?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with all of you on this fabulous panel. I think, first of all, what we've seen is over the past 10 months, President Said has really effectively and efficiently unwound nearly 10 years of democratic progress. He has really fully consolidated power into his own hands, including firing most of the government, suspending the parliament. He replaced the Supreme Judicial Council and the Independent Elections Authority with his own people, dismissed the Anti-Corruption Authority, and most recently, he fired 57 judges with the idea being that they're corrupt, but there's also a lot of political motivation behind this. And most importantly, he declared back in September most of the Constitution to be null and void. This is despite the fact that he is himself a constitutional law professor, so he knows what he's doing. This is not someone who's just sort of haphazardly taking these steps. Right now, what we are looking at is a really critical period where President Said and a hand-appointed commission have until the end of this month, so about 3 weeks, to draft a new constitution. That will be voted on in a referendum on July 25th, which marks the one-year anniversary of President Said's coup, as well as Tunisia's Republic Day, commemorating the end of the monarchy, so a very symbolic day for that referendum. And he has stated that he has the intention of having legislative elections in December, but depending on what this new constitution looks like, there may not actually be legislative elections. We kind of have to wait and see what that looks like. Looking specifically at local governance, what we've seen here is a real paradox, which is that on the one hand, if you just look at kind of Said on paper, he's actually a big supporter of local government. He wants to decentralize power down to the most local level. And his preferred form of government that we know from his statements and writings, interviews prior even to him becoming president, is that President Saeed seeks a government that's based on a series of local councils who would be elected based on basically their personal quality, not party affiliation. He wants to kind of do away with parties. And those locally selected individuals would then appoint regional and national bodies who would advise presidents. So that would be the end of sort of the parliament as we have it today, the end of legislative elections, really the end of parties. Government would be far more localized, but with the major caveat, very important caveat, that on top of that sits a very powerful president, much more powerful than the president that was the role of the president that was crafted in the 2014 Constitution. Now that's on paper. So on paper, it doesn't seem terrible. I mean, the central power of the president's not great, but in practice, Saeed has not been supportive of decentralization or local government at all. And the decentralization efforts that Tunisia embarked on starting a few years ago, which although they're certainly not perfect, they were designed to empower local actors and devolve power from the central government rather than have this very strong president with then this level of local governments there. President has not been supportive of municipal councils. He's not made any moves to elect the regional governors who are still controlled by the central state. And in fact, he actually did away with the Ministry of Local Affairs and returned many of the functions of local oversight to the Ministry of Interior, who doesn't exactly have a good track record of protecting individual rights. He also has not made good on his promise to return stolen funds to traditionally marginalized regions. President Saeed's corruption amnesty plan, which allows corrupt individuals to pay back the state in exchange for amnesty, purports to collect stolen funds and invest in Tunisia's most needed areas. Again, kind of a good idea on paper, but we have not actually seen any real movement on that front, and are not seeing any major social economic improvements or infrastructure development in the marginalized areas. And then finally, another part of the decentralization efforts and local governance is this idea of participatory democracy. And here we find another paradox, which is that while President Saeed bases his legitimacy on al-Shab yurid, what the people want, he has not actually consulted the people. And I think if we look most recently at his recent online, quote, consultation process, this process set out to gather the input of the Tunisian public on what would be the revised constitution. But this was an incredibly flawed process. Only around 7% of eligible Tunisians participated. Some of that was due to a lack of interest or just not really understanding what this process was. But there were also tremendous issues with lack of transparency, data protection, as well as lack of access and internet availability for many Tunisians, particularly in rural areas. So under President Saeed, there's really been no room for participatory democracy. And I think this has been one of the biggest frustrations amongst Tunisian civil society actors, is the lack of President Saeed and his government's engagement with the public and with civil society organizations, as well as political parties. So the bottom line is that Saeed's authoritarian power grab has really been bad for all levels of Tunisian government and society, the national and the local.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So one follow-up question that I have for you, and I think I will have it for other participants as well. So why do you think Saeed dissolved everything, starting from parties to electoral commissions but not the municipalities? Is this because they think they're so important, or because he thinks actually they don't matter? They actually don't matter. So what do you think? Why not the municipalities and everything else?
I think one reason for that is that they're so important, is that they're not that powerful and they're not really a threat to him. I mean, we have seen him remove some governors and remove some local officials. But I think, from his perspective, I mean, honestly, it could also be that he's not there, hasn't gotten there yet. But I just don't think they're as threatening to him. And what we've seen is it's only been 10 months and he's done a remarkable job at unwinding all of these processes and consolidating all this power in a relatively short period of time. But it's kind of going step by step. And some of it's proactive, the Constitution, things like that, but some of it's also reactive. And I don't think we've seen the municipalities so far represent a big threat to him. If we were to see that, I would expect that he would react quite quickly in doing something to kind of address that. But again, we don't know what this constitution is going to look like. We have a general idea of some of the main principles, but it might also be that they're all going to be, moot once this new constitution comes out, and there'll be new people. There may be, new elections for all the municipalities. So it's not worth it at this point to kind of take that step. That would be sort of my speculation, but I'm curious what others think as well.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'll come to Dia, who wrote a recent piece in the Washington Post about who supports Qais Said. And he paints a very different picture from what we think about the support base of Qais Said. So I'll come to you, Dia, with a question about, at this point, who supports President Qais Said in these moves that he's doing for the last 11 months or 10 months. And do you notice a shift in the support base of the President Said over time? I know that you did a survey. It's not an over time kind of survey, but I would like to hear from you. If you think there is a shift in the support base, and also if there is any kind of regional variations or urban rural kind of variations in the results that you see, the support basis of Qais Said.
Can you hear me now? Great. So I wanted to start with this brief overview of the evolution of Said's popularity. So we saw that after the coup, his popularity skyrocketed and the voting intention of the presidential election reached around 90%. So now he's going back to the pre-coup level. However, his competitors are not as popular as him, so he's still in a comfortable position. The political scene is still divided, but the majority of significant and political actors are opposing him. Only a minority of political parties are from the more radical left, and Hark al-Shab, the only one who is slightly more moderate than the historically Marxist parties, is still supporting him. Regarding the geographical distribution, so we don't have that much information, but I found this data from an online survey conducted by Insight on February 2022 that it shows the level of popularity of political parties. And they include the possibility of, in case Said creates a political party, how much would he get in the legislative election? So you kind of see here that there is a clear geographical distribution, the geographical variation. In those in the western part of the country tend to be more attracted to a Nahda than Qais Said. And PDL, old regime PDL, and the coast is still strong. One of the reasons why Said's party is still not that popular simply because his ideology, or if you can call it so, is based on an anti-party attitude. The same thing, we saw the similar phenomenon in the national consultation, low level of participation in the western part of the country. And this may explain to a certain extent with the lack of technology infrastructure. But at the same time, when we know that the government deployed or gave internet access during, I think, an entire day, and they also provided computers in youth houses in the regions, I think they kind of moderates the effect of technology access. So we still have the same phenomenon, clear geographical distribution, the level of support. Regarding the age distribution and the base of Said, this is a graph by Intifada where they show how those who are in their 30s are highly, those who are in the 30s up to the late 40s are even more actually up to the late 50s. Adults are much more willing to participate than younger people who usually have better access to technology and more familiar with technology. So Interestingly, here we see a shift in comparison with the last elections. During the last election in 2019, in both the first round and second round, we saw that Qais Said managed to capture much more youth than his competitors. So now we go back here, we kind of see that he's somehow losing that base. Then, if we also look at the level of education, so most of people who participated to the national consultation have a relatively higher level of education, disproportionate in a country where with only 13% of people with university degrees. I think 48% of or 42% of participants with university level. I think it's pretty significant, and it's pretty much the same phenomenon that we saw during the presidential election. He managed to capture much more higher Tunisians with higher education than anyone else. However, what's interesting here is that when we go back and look at data from the national consultation, we find also that unemployed people are overrepresented in a country where the unemployment rate is fluctuating between 15 and 18%. We have here 27.5% of the participants were unemployed. I think to kind of summarize here, Qais Said is relying mostly on adults between 30 and up to 60 years old in the coast, and he's losing progressively younger people, and he's still capitalizing on those who are unemployed, and most of them are young. And so that's regarding the shift that we saw during the last 2 years.
Yeah, for those who are not familiar with the national consultation, can you talk a little bit about that? This is the online dialogue that Qais Said started, right?
Exactly. So early December, President Qais Said announced a roadmap that would lead to the adoption of a constitution and legislative elections. In order to give some legitimacy to the choices that would probably be made in the constitution, he initiated this online consultation where he asked, I forgot the exact number of questions, but they were clearly oriented. He wanted to claim that he has some level of support for his for the choices he would make during the constitution drafting process. However, the level of participation was very low. It was around 6% of the voting body, and he mobilized his local networks, although they are kind of heterogeneous and not necessarily well coordinated. He mobilized state capacity to push for participation, and gave free access to internet. And despite that, only less than 500,000 Tunisians did participate. He is convinced, and people managed to convince him, that the reason why there's such a low participation is simply because the opposition were hacking the system, and the system was under attack. In the slides, and actually the slides, we can find in the official website of the National Consultation, we find the number of attacks on the servers, which are not that significant in comparison with even unexposed servers. But he thinks that if there was a conspiracy against the National Consultation, that's why it failed. And he thinks that initially his goal was to get around, I think, 2 million voters, 2 million participants, and then they reduced the target to, I think, 1 million, and they end up accepting what they got, and they think it's enough.
So the argument, Dia, that you're making in the Washington Post piece, which we will come back in the Q&A, have a lot of questions about that. So the argument that you're making in this article is that Said is relying on a very narrow base, and which is shrinking. This is the first argument you make. And then the second argument that you're making is that these people are willing to express support, but when there are actions to be taken, they do not take the action. So and this is, you think it's a worrying issue, because when it comes to supporting him and supporting the new constitution and the new measures that he's trying to take, so there's not, you expect that you're not going to see similar support, like the presidential support, for instance, or those who express support, they're not actually going to show up. This is the other point that you make in the piece. Did I phrase this right?
Yes, exactly. So we talk in the piece about several. We use several pieces of evidence. The participation in the consultation is one among others. We mentioned how the level of participation in the local elections that happened during the last months was as low as the level of participation in the national consultation. I've been trying to estimate the number of protesters, and I followed very closely protests that was supposed to be a mass protest that happened after the publication of our piece. There was, I think, two weeks of intense mobilization on the ground and online. And it's, I documented it, but I didn't publish anything about it yet. And they were only able to mobilize a few hundreds. Despite using the use of buses, and despite the fact they brought people from the interior regions, where we have videos of people in the buses and everything. And so there were only a few hundred, and they represent only a faction, actually, of people who are supporting him. So there are high divisions between his supporters. There are already some polls circulating that show that the level of participation in the referendum will be very low. It will be probably higher or slightly higher than the participation in the national consultation, but not enough to get 50%, which is usually the quorum needed to pass constitutional amendments. But Said has not only a problem of mobilization, but has a problem of recruitment and human resources. We saw this in yesterday's appointments of governors. He found himself appointing people with absolutely no professional experience. Among them was, for example, the governor of Sidi Bouzid, got his degree 21 years ago in history and been working as a mason during these 2 decades, waiting for a job in the public sector. And so he's not qualified to be, I don't think he's qualified to be a governor of a region like Sidi Bouzid that needs much more attention than other regions. And we also see that in the recruitment around him in the presidency, they've been losing so many allies, and he's more and more isolated. So, I mean, I can keep talking for more time about this, but I'll probably answer the questions later. But I think he seriously has a problem of human resources aside from his mobilization capacity that we talked about in the piece.
Thank you, Dia. Thank you so much. Intissar, so how did this crisis impact the functioning of municipalities? And now being the only democratically elected entity, so that there is a presidency and then the municipalities and nothing else in between. So what role can they play during this critical phase in the country, or are they already playing an increased role? So what's your take on what's going on the ground there?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Marwa. In terms of, just tracing back slightly to what has been the relationship between the president and the government at the moment, since July 25th with local authorities. And I think that it's seen a shift from the first initial few weeks and months after the July 25th, which was, we saw a kind of more direct frontal attack on local authorities. And it's shifted more towards a kind of uneasy entente, which is characterized by local level conflict. So most of the conflict is happening at the moment between governors and municipalities. So in the beginning, the municipalities, I think, were, like every elected institution and state institution were feeling they were facing uncertainty. They were unclear as to who they should be speaking to at the central level. Municipalities in Tunisia are still very much tied to central government in terms of approvals, projects, investment, finance. And so obviously on a daily basis, they have to actually, engage with regional authorities and central authorities. So in the first few weeks, I think that there was a lot of nervousness, given that they were the last elected councils left standing. And we saw in the beginning actually movements in various municipalities, a kind of dégage movement by groups who were said to be Qais Said supporters, who actually tried to remove the municipal council or force the mayor to resign. That this was a kind of opportunity to get rid of every single elected politician, so they should all follow suit. And so we saw that, physically there were these kinds of movements happening in various municipalities, especially large ones. And at the same time, there was rhetoric deployed by Qais Said directly against municipalities. So we saw, for example, in ministerial cabinet meetings, specific references to those who, want to turn Tunisia into mini states, where municipalities are governing themselves effectively, but they are undermining the unity of the state, and attacking the very idea of decentralization and Chapter 7 itself of the Constitution. And then we saw, obviously, with the Sfax waste crisis, which was a huge confrontation that happened over a long-running issue, actually, over waste collection and management across the different municipalities of Sfax. And at that moment, Qais Said saw it as an opportunity, it seems, to attack the municipalities and to say, well, they are not doing their job, that there are political parties or actors who are trying to fan the tensions and provoke this crisis. And there was a vocal response at that point from the municipalities themselves to explain that actually, hang on, waste management isn't actually part of our powers. So, don't try to put this on us. And so there has been this kind of, back and forth conflict between them. And at the same time, we saw, in the last few months, we saw attempts to also expand the powers of central government over mayors. So there have been various incidents happening. For example, in March, we saw in Yerkes that there was the first delegate who was an appointed regional official, was attempted to basically replace the mayor, which the local code on local authorities actually removed this possibility that you can't simply, as a central government, just dismiss a mayor without any sort of judicial process. And so in March, you saw the délégué, who was centrally appointed by the Ministry of Interior, simply try to say, oh, the mayor is not doing his job in this municipality. He is not managing to keep order and to resolve a conflict that was happening. And so I can simply, through a written decision, simply replace him and become the interim mayor myself. What we've seen, though, is that there has been a pushback by municipal councils. And so in the beginning, there was a lot of nervousness and conflict, actually, within the body that represents municipalities or municipal mayors, actually, which is the FNCT, the National Federation of Tunisian Communes. So the mayors are the members of this, but it represents all the municipalities of Tunisia. And this body was initially very divided. We saw actually there were mixed messages coming out of the body. There was a statement that was issued by the president of the body that was very strongly criticizing and condemning July 25th measures as a coup against the constitution, saying that this will not be accepted, etc. And then very quickly we saw opposing voices coming from mayors who were saying, hang on, this is not legitimate. You don't speak for all of the municipalities. And there were counter statements that were issued by mayors of different political backgrounds. So we saw actually that there was a kind of division within the municipalities. But what has really happened since is that in parallel, why we see, as Mohamed-Dhia was mentioning, the popularity of the president dropping in the general population and more people within civil society and politics, etc., questioning these decisions that seem to be eroding institutions and rights, you see a similar move within the FNCT to say, actually, the initial position was correct in some ways, to say that this is a dangerous move that is undermining local authorities. As there have been more and more decisions coming out, such as the decision to dissolve the Ministry of Local Affairs, which had accompanied municipalities, and very specifically not overseeing or supervising municipalities, but it had the function of accompanying them in the decentralization process. We saw instead a move by decree to shift the Municipal Local Affairs directorates back into the Ministry of Interior, which has a very negative connotation, given that there was a conscious move away from this, to move municipalities away from the Ministry of Interior, which had a relationship of a history of controlling and trying to direct the work of municipalities in particular ways. And so we've seen this pushback by municipal councils. The FNCT has played quite an important role, which is interesting to see, because these bodies, prove themselves or fail to prove themselves in such situations. In this case, it's actually had the effect of moving them towards a more unified position, interestingly. Of course, there is dissent, but we see actually that there are more and more members within the FNCT who are asking the FNCT to provide them with legal advice, for example, when they are being bothered by regional governors who are seeking to intervene in their decision-making. The FNCT has taken legal action against decisions issued by the Ministry of Interior in the administrative court. They've also put in place actually an advisory service, a legal advice service for municipalities to help them to, figure out what are their rights vis-a-vis the central government. And so I think that it's shown the role that such bodies can play in supporting local authorities. So at the moment, I think what we see is a kind of stalemate. The government is continuing to try to extend its control over the municipalities. So in addition to the Ministry of Interior's, interventions, we see also regional governors who are trying to really get involved in every single little detail of municipal decision-making in many cases. We see also that specific conflicts that arise between regional governors and mayors over sometimes quite small things. For example, in one region, the regional governor was insisting that any correspondence that comes out of the municipality should actually not just say the name of the municipality, but it should say Ministry of Interior on it, to show that municipalities actually belong to the Ministry of Interior. And so there have been these kind of symbolic struggles where municipalities have pushed back. And interestingly, most of the time, the administrative court has gone along with, sided with the municipalities to say that these things are an overreach in terms of legal powers. So we have this kind of struggle that's going on. At the same time, we have a complete freezing of the decentralization process. There is absolutely nothing happening in terms of discussing the transfer of powers to subnational level that was supposed to be happening on a gradual basis. We have a number of different bodies that are tasked with managing this process that was set up under the code, the 2018 Local Authorities Code. So we have, for example, a higher authority on local finances, which is supposed to be overseeing how financial resources can be transferred to the subnational level. These bodies are essentially not working. I mean, if you speak to the senior bureaucrats, they are being completely frozen out by the Ministry of Interior. The head of that body, for example, requested a meeting with the Minister of Interior 8 months ago. He still hasn't gotten back to her. And so you can really see that the whole architecture for implementing and advancing decentralization is going nowhere. It's effectively frozen. There is a clear intention to replace that process with something else. At the same time, I mean, this is not just a political sort of tussle, but this is also about municipal services. This is about functioning municipal services for citizens. And I think that most municipalities appear to have found a way to get things past regional and central government, they are more or less playing in extra time at the moment, because don't forget that it's the last year of their mandate. So there were due to be municipal elections in 2023. So this is to the benefit of municipalities in some way, because many of them have already really done most of the projects that they wanted to do, adopted the budgets, put in place the infrastructure projects. For those that have been effective, obviously, there are also many ineffective municipalities that have been riven by conflict. And so they are trying to do what they can through managing the relationship with the regional governor, not getting into conflicts in some situations, trying to find allies within the administration. But of course, many have been blocked. I mean, I've spoken to a number of municipalities who say that their investment projects are being blocked by ministries. And this is the problem with the fact that decentralization had not advanced enough, even prior to July 25th, that municipalities are still very much tied to central government when it comes to authorizations, if we're talking about use of land, if we're talking about financial resources, if we're talking about the Ministry of Infrastructure, Ministry of Investment. They all still have very much a say in the resources and the programs of municipalities. And there is also a push to strengthen actually the delegations at the expense of municipalities. So the delegations are the deconcentrated bodies that are appointed by central government. And what we see is that these bodies are becoming very active in the last year, setting up, local development committees, using funding from central government to set up parallel local development programs. So there is still very much a competition, I think, at the local level that is going on. But I think that this uncertainty, the fact that it's come in the last year of the municipalities has, as I mentioned, meant that it's not affecting as much as we would have thought the programming of municipalities. At the same time, I think that that what emerges is that the struggle is very much around the law, around implementing the law, around the extent of legal powers that central government can exercise. And for the most part, these have been resolved in the favor of municipalities up until now. Of course, the recent struggle that's been going on between Qais Said and the judiciary also suggests that this chapter is not exactly complete. And so we'll continue to see some struggles there.
Thank you so much, Intissar. This is really great. And I want to move to Lana, and I want to ask her specifically about the effect of the ongoing crisis on these municipalities' ability to provide services. And so Intissar can talk briefly about that, but if you can tell us in more detail about the ability now of these municipalities to provide services, and also whether this current institutional vacuum has benefited these local entities in any way, or maybe not. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, thank you, Marwa, and to my co-panelists for these interventions. So let me try to make a theoretical point and give an example to illustrate it and come back to the theoretical point. So I have a problem in general thinking of all these dynamics as ruptures. It's like every few years we have a rupture, we start from zero, we say before and after. And I want to think more of continuities with openings. So the rearrangement of old forms in new ways, not just as scholars who study the region, as scholars who are interested in democratic change or backsliding, whatever we want to call it, to think a little bit about, to shift the temporality, the temporal way we think of change and the way it comes about, and the conditioning factors that allow it to emerge or not. And I'm going to counter a point that side I mentioned at the beginning. I do not think, and then I think Intissar kind of provided evidence to support it, I do not believe that municipalities are not important or not a threat for Qais Said. I do not think it's true. They may not be a threat, but they are definitely a space for rearranging political relations. And that's why I believe he's more careful in the sense that he doesn't quite know exactly what are the best ways, or maybe rethinking the best ways to meddle in the municipal terrain to rearrange relationships. Do not forget that. I mean, I think, you started by saying this, by asking Intissar this question, that the municipalities remain the closest state to citizens, right? They remain that state at the local level right now. And so I do not believe municipalities are not important nor a threat. I do believe they are a complex terrain where it's not easy to determine who loses and who wins. And I want to say that despite everything we're saying about Qais Said and his interventions, this man isn't a sovereign in absolute terms, right? His intervention, especially in relation to like service delivery in municipalities. So municipalities now provide services according to a World Bank funded program that's now attaining almost its 10th year in implementation. It's about $500 million World Bank program that had started in 2014 and had been discussed since 2011, was put in implementation in 2014, according to which municipalities provide services to citizens according to performance criteria that the central level uses to deblock funds, basically, to municipalities, most of which cannot finance their own service delivery. They need funding from the central government, but that this world program made the allocation criteria for which transparent and etc. So, and the aspect that citizens see is that they come to municipalities to participate in the sense of determining priority investments within their neighborhoods. And in the sense, again, in insisting on continuities, this is still happening in municipalities, right? The parliament is not working, everything is frozen, etc. But in municipalities, citizens are still invited to come and determine priority investments in their neighborhoods. What is perhaps changing a little bit is the way that the participation is happening. So in these participatory planning meetings, usually citizens are invited into a plenary session. Then there are meetings. So these are all in-person meetings within zones for determining priority investments, and then kind of another plenary to vote on different investments. Again, with very small budgets, lots of problems with this program and the way resources are allocated across the territory. But what we're seeing now is, instead of only direct meetings, these individuals called zone representatives or neighborhood representatives are playing a more important role in negotiating between, or in like doing the relay between citizens and municipalities. This was part of the exercise, of the original design of the exercise, but it seems now that there's a bigger push by municipalities to enforce or empower the role of these representatives, who actually do kind of canvassing, like they do door to door. They actually collect in some municipalities, not all of them. So I know this is happening in places like Ariana and Rawed a lot, and less so. And I think this is goes in line with the changes away from political parties, right? As we know, that Qais Said is a president who does not have a political party and instead works through these organizations like Harakat Shabab Ariana, for instance, or GLD Tahmish, who are very localized NGOs, right? They're not national level organizations. They're like neighborhood level, city level. And some of these people who run these organizations also play this relaying role with the state. So we have to think carefully here who becomes the relay with the local government and who counts as the legitimate kind of voice or authentic street voice, citizen voice. So when we talk about participation, who is it actually who is participating and actually making it to these spaces? And on that note, the second part of your question, I think, is this idea of institutional vacuum. Are municipalities benefiting from this? So here's the thing. I do not think there's an institutional vacuum in that sense, right? Again, the Tunisian government in general, most of its investment programs run because of on loans from the World Bank and others, and these are continuing. And again, to think about continuities and change, like look at these continuities, to trace again these continuities and what these institutional arrangements depend on. Yes, there are, judges being removed, parliament activity stopped, but the administration, and this is an important distinction here, like the idara, is very much still functions according to like preset preset routines, which brings us back to this idea of the deconcentrated that Intissar mentioned, the deconcentrated versus the decentralized state and the advancement of decentralization reforms. It is not that with July 25, we have now it's a tense relationship between deconcentrated and decentralized entities. This has existed since before the revolution, right? This has marked actually Tunisia's history throughout since post-independence. And with some more archival work that I did this year, it shows us that it has existed even during colonial rule, right? There has always been tension between a deconcentrated and a decentralized state. This is a continuous factor that will determine how the situation evolves. It is true that now I think municipalities are much more emboldened to say no to governors and to be like, you are trespassing on my domain. And I do believe that the role of the administrative court is actually a very interesting one, because we are seeing, like the Qais Said general vibe, if we can call it such, a judicialization of politics, right? That everything is resolved it is his vibe, that everything is resolved on the legal terrain, which is never the case, right? Like, it's never the case that we can resolve all politics on the legal terrain, no matter how much you meddle with that or you try to rearrange it in that sense. So I really, again, want to insist on this point of thinking about continuities with openings and the factors that condition this, rather than ruptures and upending structures. It is not true. Very many structures are still the same, but there are movements within them, and there are openings and closings within them. And that's, I think, where we should pay attention to the details, to see actually on the ground what is changing away, from polls, from even election results, from all these things, to look at this institutional architecture and think of the gaps, continuities within it. And places like deconcentrated versus decentralized entities, confrontations is a very interesting place to start looking at these things and looking at citizens. Because, these, for example, in the last, I'm sure you've heard of this last example. I mean, people who look at Tunisia specific stuff constantly, the removal of constructions on the maritime domain, right? A lot of activities of municipalities and destroying, like enforcing state power of not allowing people to build on maritime domain. These are things that are like, it's interesting that this is happening now. And what does it mean that there's an enforcement power for the state, for the local state at this moment? But I'm basically pleading to look at these very small things that may look insignificant, to follow through on the continuities and the broader processes they point at.
Thank you so much, Lana. This is a really great perspective. So I have one more question for each of you. And let's do kind of a brief kind of answer for my second question, because I want to have a discussion among us and also open for the attendees if they have questions for you. And also if Dhia or Intissar wants to comment, or Sarah wants to comment on Lana's point. So kind of have also a discussion in our own, within our own group. So I think my second question for each of you was about kind of the longer term implications. So for Sarah, I will start with you again. And I'm very curious. I know you wrote a lot about the role of international community and how they can mitigate the crises in Tunisia. And I really want to hear from you about the long-term implications and how international community can help. And also, if you have any kind of policy kind of take on that.
Sure, thank you. And I just wanted to briefly say, first of all, everyone's interventions have been really, really interesting and useful. And I just wanted to kind of clarify, Lana, I completely agree with you on the idea that municipalities are incredibly important. And I do think, this is the way that people see and feel government in their everyday lives. And my point that I was trying to make, that I don't think I made very well, is more that right now on Saeed's priority lists, their existence is not a threat. He does, as Intissar really explained very well, he has the Ministry of Interior to kind of oversee things and to sort of do his dirty work. But it hasn't kind of risen to the level of Saeed at this point. And at the same time, the municipalities, this could be a mistake by Saeed, and we could actually see them as his undoing in the long term. But sort of more generally, I think that the long-term implications are really not very good. I think it's difficult to see at this point how we kind of get out of the continued authoritarian consolidation over the next several months. And I just frankly don't think Saeed's likely to back down. He has set out to reconfigure the Tunisian political system, and I think he's not going to stop until he does that. And nothing that internal or external actors have done so far seems to have much of an effect on him. He's kind of like railroading through his plan to reform Tunisia in his vision. And he also doesn't seem to care about public opinion, despite the fact that he sort of bases his legitimacy on public support. I think that we sort of need to be honest with ourselves, and the international community needs to be honest with itself, that Tunisia is probably not going to go backwards. I don't think we're going to see the reinstatement of the former government or the parliament. And I think that we sort of need to acknowledge that the political system was paralyzed before July 25th, as Lana, again, very rightly mentioned this idea of continuity. It wasn't like there was this major rupture on July 25th. The problems that existed then have carried over. And so I think, it's worth having a real sort of inclusive national dialogue, which many people have been pushing for, about what the future of Tunisia looks like, rather than trying to push for a return to kind of the past. But I don't think, again, that Saeed is really open to that. So I think as far as the international community is concerned, there's this really crucial period between now and July 25th. And every day that passes, is one less day to actually make an impact on the future of Tunisia. If the referendum passes, I think Saeed will view himself as bulletproof in a way that even if, as Dhia, rightly mentioned, that very few people may vote in the referendum, he's still going to say the majority of those who voted yes. And he's already said we don't need 50% of the population to approve the referendum. And I think, frankly, it's likely to pass, given the fact that a lot of civil society organizations and political parties, understandably, are choosing to boycott. I understand that motivation 100%. I probably would if I were in their shoes as well. But I think that that's the wrong move. I think that there should be instead a really concerted effort, a mobilization campaign to get people to vote no, particularly if we see that Saeed's supporters are small in numbers or not willing or not really motivated to go out and vote. It would be a lot easier to overturn this. That doesn't mean he's going to accept the results. That doesn't mean it's going to be a free and fair election. But I think that's one opportunity to kind of push back. I think the international community in particular has a really important role as well. And it's, any effort to return Tunisia to a democratic path has to be led by Tunisians, but the US and Europe can support civil society organizations, parties, individuals, the media, those who are working to reestablish democracy in Tunisia. I think what we've seen is that the international community so far has been pretty ambivalent about Saeed's actions. And while they've started to show a lot more sort of vocal displeasure, there's not really any question about President Saeed's intentions and his disinterest in democracy. But we're still not seeing any sort of major, what I would consider a forceful or effective pushback. And so what I have been calling for, I just put out a piece on this on Thursday, is a sort of new approach, particularly folks in the US, but to ice out Saeed. And that is to refrain from funding the government of Tunisia itself. What I think the international community should be doing is continue funding levels. Don't cut funding to Tunisia, but shift any funding that goes directly to the Tunisian government away and instead give that money to civil society, Tunisian people, political parties, traditional partners that are outside of the government, as well as humanitarian issues, so that you're not kind of turning your backs on the Tunisian people. I also think the sticks that have been employed have been really kind of useless, that Saeed has really either lashes out when they're employed or just ignores them. And so while I don't think we should be rewarding Saeed for his past behavior, I think one potential way forward that's really low risk is to develop a menu of carrots to try to entice him. And this would be explicit benchmarks of positive behavior that if he achieves them, for example, if he postpones the referendum, or if he has free and fair legislative elections with a parliament that actually has real power, if he ends the state of emergency, you have public benchmarks that are tied to these things where you could give budget support to the government of Tunisia or other assistance packages. That could also be diplomatic support, different carrots. And if he doesn't do them, it's no cost. But if he does, there is some real, reward for that behavior. And then conversely, having clear public red lines with punishment attached if Saeed violates them, rather than this kind of generic idea we've seen from the international community, which is we just want to return Tunisia to a democratic path. We don't really know what that looks like and how you actually get there, what those benchmarks would be. So I think you need some sort of real, clear, and very public red lines, just banning parties, extending the presidential term, enacting the leaked draft NGO law. If those things are done, there should be a concerted, coordinated effort, particularly, if you could get a G7 effort to come out of this to say, we are, as a united international community, we're going to say, if you do that, then you're punished with X. I realize that's not easy to achieve, but I think these sort of statements, these sort of coordinated approaches seem to be the most effective.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Dhia, I want to ask you about also the long-term implications on this crisis on youth and the historically marginalized communities in Tunisia. So, what are the long-term implications of this crisis on these groups?
Well, I would say since Tunisia is still a highly centralized country with relying on interconnected network of interconnected political actors and institutions, relying on the coordination of these interconnected political actors and institutions, I think that what we may see is a protracted stalemate, meaning a balance of power that would prevent Saeed from moving forward and would prevent the opposition from winning over him. And this may lead to the non-implementation of any kind of reforms. You may have World Bank programs or you may have IMF programs, but as long as Saeed doesn't get the backing of UJDT and the political actors and the local branches of the government and the governors and everyone on the board, it's very difficult to implement that. I mean, even during the last year, there were many reforms that were passed by the parliament that were consensual among elites, but were not implemented. I think the situation will get worse now because of the political fragmentation that was not as serious as it is today before July 25th. The business actors at the national level are having problems of visibility. They will be less and less willing to make investments. In February, I think we saw the very first month in recent Tunisia's history during the last decade or 2 decades, during which there was zero declared foreign investment. So the impossibility to implement any reform would lead to the deterioration of the overall economic situation. I think it's inevitable as long as we have the current balance of power. And this will make the overall environment, the political, economic, and social environment, very difficult to navigate for everyone because of our predictability. Saeed is highly unpredictable. He doesn't trust anyone, and it's very difficult to work with him. So this will make Tunisian youth much more frustrated. We may see a continuous rise of both formal and informal migration, brain drain. We've already been seeing that during the last years, and it may intensify. But also informal migration. Saeed is trying to be tough on the informal side to kind of get the support and get some recognition from Italy and the EU, but I think it will be very difficult to manage. But also, since Saeed is relying on young people, mobilization on the ground, their frustration from the impossibility to achieve the radical promises that Saeed made during the last few months or years, I think it would lower the pro-Saeed mobilization and would lead to more social contestation that would be difficult to contain or to respond to with effective policies. However, it's not clear whether or not the we'll see more anti-Said political mobilization. We may see, it may happen, young people may understand that it's difficult to move forward with Said in power, and there is a need to make things change. But also it can lead to simply political resignation. People may disengage and get into their, become private citizens or move out of the country, and we're already seeing that.
Thank you so much, Dhia. Intissar, so I want to ask you about the long-term implications on the already very wide regional disparities, and how can civil society undertake the role of the state during this critical time to bridge these disparities and mitigate them?
Well, I think we have to look at the question, can we really talk about the long term at the moment in Tunisia? I don't think that is the timeline that any actor in Tunisia is possibly looking at. And that is part of the problem, I think, that has caused, and contributed to many of these pre-existing problems before July 25th, is the temporality, coming back to Lana's point, of the time horizons of these actors, that in the last 10 years, it's been practically impossible, I think, for any actor outside or inside government to think long term, with the institutional reconfigurations that we've seen, with the government instability, partly produced by electoral law. And so the long term is a term you don't often come across, I think, in discussions in Tunisia. It's very much about the crisis, the next crisis. And it does come back, I think, to the point Lana made very well about, these are ongoing conflicts. We need to think about, where does Said fit in with these pre-existing conflicts? And how will he strengthen one side or how will he strengthen another? Because, we see that there are these institutions that have been standing. There are networks that are, existing networks that are looking for inroads, looking for actors to latch on to in ways that can influence the political process. We are still talking 10 years after the revolution about, Tajamma, about the former regime. And when you dissolve a party that really ran the country for 10 years, I mean, those people don't just disappear. And so I think very little empirical work, or not enough, has gone really into thinking about these networks and how they've been reconfigured to make use of the opportunities that have presented themselves in the political landscape since 2011. And so, we see that there was already resistance to decentralization before July 25th from various bodies, from the administration, from economic elites, who simply have no interest in really working at the local level. For them, the local level is not interesting. It's the central level where there are finances, where there are resources, where there is public procurement. And so decentralization has very few friends, unfortunately, even before July 25th. And so, we have to think about what are the underlying problems that decentralization was trying to fix, which was, one, development. The main, driving the motor of the revolution was development, especially regional development in marginalized regions. And secondly, democracy, the idea that actually when you give bodies, that are elected powers, they have to be responsive to those locally who elected them. So definitely freezing this decentralization process will have implications in the long term. I mean, municipalities cannot plan beyond the next few months. And I think that uncertainty, the fact that we simply don't even know what is in this draft constitution, means that it's very difficult for others to really position themselves and form a strategy. I've spoken to, municipal representatives in the national body, the FNCT, to mayors. They're all saying, we don't have a strategy. We don't really know because, in a way, it's this very short timeline that Said has adopted is a very intelligent strategy to prevent any counter strategy from emerging. And so I think that the long term is a big question mark in Tunisia that I can't possibly hope to answer. But I think the regional inequalities are going to worsen. And I think this is the problem, that the regional inequalities are the product of a failed governance model, of a failed economic model. And as long as that's not addressed, as long as Tunisia's position in the global economy is not addressed, as long as the concentration, the really excessive concentration of economic and political power in the hands of a few small groups of people are not addressed, we won't see a change in the model, in the development model and decision making. So we will still have 90% of industry being concentrated on the coast, 85% of GDP concentrated on the coast. You also have regions where you have, half the national average when it comes to very basic things, such as the rate of connection to drinking water, the rate of connection to sanitation and sewage. And unfortunately, after COVID, the situation has become even more critical economically for people in marginalized regions. So I think that there is going to be a debate. It is not at all clear, will civil society participate? That was the second part of your discussion. There is a debate within Tunisian civil society whether to participate in the referendum. You have, Sarah touched on this, you have those who say it's better to participate and to mobilize citizens to vote and say no. There are those who say the whole process, I can't be a witness essentially to a process that has no integrity, where I cannot guarantee that my vote will be counted in a free and fair way. And I think there is a real sort of a question mark, around the ability of civil society to become united around a common position that can have some impact, that can actually influence where this referendum is heading. And I think that's due to the fact that there's so little visibility. It makes it impossible for people to plan and to strategize. In terms of whether civil society can step in to address socioeconomic issues, we've seen actually civil society has been playing a role in the last 10 years. There's been an explosion of NGOs. They have been working in a range of large projects, particularly led by big donors such as the GIZ, the USAID, et cetera, who've worked a lot on local development, partnering with NGOs. But I think we can't really say we're at the stage where, NGOs are able to really have a large-scale impact on job creation. It is still the state that needs to invest in these regions. The state needs to provide the basic infrastructure that allows people to actually invest, to allows people to travel within these regions freely, enable them to actually set up businesses, etc. We've seen actually, in my view, civil society has been most effective in the socioeconomic field where it partners with state institutions, with public institutions, because that way you can create institutional change. Otherwise, civil society interventions risk remaining really small scale and having really limited impact. So I think that's the ability of civil society to step in here is quite limited.
Thank you so much, Intissar. So I'm gonna pose this last question to Lana, and then I will open the floor for questions. So for attendees, if you'd like to prepare your questions, we will have good 20 minutes for Q&A. Get ready with your questions. So I'm going to move to Lana with my last question for this roundtable about the gendered effects of the ongoing crisis. Lana, if you can discuss it on the local level, the national level. I know you focus more on the local. It'll be great about the gendered effects of the ongoing crisis in Tunisia.
Yeah, so again, not to rain on everybody's parade, I don't think anything good is happening with gender, because I don't think that's the only achievements or rights that on the gender agenda that were obtained in Tunisia were obtained through a lot of struggle, not because anybody was paying attention to this. It's by women who mobilized to get what they wanted when they wanted it. And I think in that sense, Kais Said is not different from all his predecessors, appointing Najwa Bouden as the female prime minister, who you see even in I see her on TV in meetings with the president, always nodding, always in there's a very particular also appearance of gender that is being played here that is not different at all from the truc de complaisance, gender as oh yeah, we're progressive, we declare it as such, but in reality it's just lip service, paying really lip service to increasing the role of women in public service. It doesn't mean anything that he appointed her as a female prime. Really doesn't mean anything. In terms of at the local level, actually, there are two aspects of this. We know now that we have very many female governments as heads of municipalities across the territory. This is a project Intissar and I have discussed at length as a potential project to empirically collect data on their experiences in local governance, especially that we know that they were submitted to a lot. they're not outside the system, right? Even July 24 before or without it, they were submitted to a lot of harassment in their campaigns because they're not outside the general system that's where seeing women in government wasn't necessarily as common, perhaps, as elected heads of local governments. And so I think empirically we need more research looking at the experiences of these female mayors. From what I know, during COVID, I know that very many female mayors stepped up, to try to manage municipalities in very difficult conditions. They weren't very successful at it, not because they didn't try, but because they still have to deal with a deconcentrated state that is primarily male, right? A male governor, a male delegate, first delegate, and not just male as in gendered male, but like a masculine, state where it's not a gendered state in the sense that where attention to like social services, care facilities isn't necessarily a priority. And the other aspect of this is the participation of female citizens at the local level in municipalities. And here too, like, nothing has been done to actually empower, not in the sense of paying lip service again to empowerment, but actually providing jobs, subsidizing care labor for these women to integrate the labor market, to be able to ensure to account for the social reproduction, invisible labor that they do, to free up their time basically to participate at the local level. Really, nothing has been done, and I don't think, and again, like it has been historically the case, women will do their thing and take their own rights by mobilizing. And Tunisia has a long history of this, even under really extremely harsh conditions against them. So in that sense, I am hopeful about the ability of people to keep organizing and to keep pushing things forward, not just women, but I do want to insist that, for me at least, Tunisia, and without using the cliche of hope of the Arab uprisings and all these things, but I do want to insist, which I don't think it's like, these are the wrong terms, absolutely, to talk about Tunisia, because it forecloses things we don't look at, but to insist on the dynamism that still exists in the country and to insist on taking this dynamism seriously and not to like foreclose opportunities by saying, oh, it has ended 10 years later, to pay attention to the dynamics that are happening on the ground and to really try to understand geopolitically and locally how they are positioned and how as scholars we can continue studying them and continue thinking about this region.
Thank you so much, Lana. So now I would like to open the floor for questions from the attendees and the participant in GLD. Do you have questions for the panelists?
We do have some questions here. I'm just trying to get them to you. Ellen, you can ask them.
I can just ask them in a normal asking. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Speak loud.
Yeah.
So first I want to thank the panelists. I find this incredibly interesting. I really have learned a lot. So appreciate that. Then I wanted to ask one question of Lana specifically, and then Lana and Intissar. So Lana, you mentioned the World Bank programs and of course the continuity in a way and how they've been, continued to be rolled out since 2014 essentially, and in sort of design since 2011. And it strikes me that what you're really arguing is that those programs in many ways have circumvented the state to begin with. I'm interested in knowing if that's how I should understand your argument and the extent to which the World Bank may be sort of reconsidering its design. And then the second question is for Lana and Intissar, and that's that both of you have mentioned at different times, either municipalities or some of the federations. I think Lana, you mentioned Ariana, if I remember correctly, and then also Intissar, you pointed to the sort of the role of the municipal federation. So the question I have is, if we can understand sort of who and when and what allows some packets of pushback which are different than others.
Intissar, do you want to go? Do you want to go?
I don't mind. Okay. So, so I'm still writing the question down, but I'll think as I'm talking. So I think that that's a really good question, Ellen. I've been asking myself that question too. What determines the kind of response you have? Why do different mayors develop different strategies? And I was already asking this question before July 25th about the relationship between mayors and regional governors. Because I interviewed so many mayors around the country, and you had so many different strategies emerging. Those who try to, move things along diplomatically, those who enter into frontal confrontation, those who find their way through inside the system. And I think it really depends on the resources, individuals can draw on. There are obviously people are formatted by these institutions, but at the same time, I found that the profile of the mayor really makes a difference. We cannot deny the management style, the profile, the character, their appetite for conflict. These different styles generate different strategies for how to deal with conflict. I found that there were mayors who, really jumped at the opportunity to enter into a conflict with regional governor. And these are the ones who are also taking on sort of central government at the moment. And of course, they need to draw on resources. So then there is the point of resources. What kind of resources do people have? And the kind of important resources I've seen that determine whether mayors and municipal councils, stand up to regional governors, whatever, are, first of all, legal resources. How well do they understand the law? How easily can they draw on someone who can understand the law? And that's why the FNCT is very important, because there is a judicialization, as Lana mentioned, of this fight. And I think it's very interesting to see that it is the kind of the final frontier when it comes to these conflicts, that there is, at a certain level, the Tunisian state does things by the book. And this is something that I found interesting during my research, is that even under Ben Ali, the Ben Ali regime really went to great lengths to do things with a cover of legality. And so, making sure that he hired the best judges, that he appointed those as ministers of justice or the best law professors, as advisors, even things as I remember that they in the transitional justice process, I think it was Slim Shiboub, the brother-in-law of the president, Ben Ali, who was describing how they used to bring in produce, fraudulently, and so that he wouldn't have to pay as much taxes or import taxes. And they didn't just do this by sort of just bring it in. He passed it off as, they would pass, pistachios off as like peanuts or something. An example is you bring in something that's very high value, and you get the customs to certify it as something else. And they would say, we would bring a proportion, and we would get them to just look at that and then, certify the rest. Because it's interesting to see how the Tunisian state behaves in relation to law. There is a high degree of legal formalism, and to be seen to respect the law, the letter of the law, if not the spirit. And we can see the spirit of the law is very much being violated, but it is still important for institutions to respect the letter of the law. And this is why, we need to understand that officials are also standing up to Qais Said in some ways, and judges, not because necessarily, they are, fighting for democracy, but because they are deeply uncomfortable being made to do things for which they might be held accountable later, and to do things that go outside what they've been taught as being, respecting the letter of the law. So I think really understanding the legal culture in Tunisia here is important to understanding the conflict that's going on.
So on the World Bank program, so I think there will be another generation of it that should be under negotiation right now. So it will be under, it will be not under negotiation, like there will be talks now to relaunch another one, just because there isn't another pot of money to finance. Tunisia will have to finance, the government will have to finance local investments through bank loans, like it has done for a very long time. And but the interesting thing about, I think, this program is during its 10 years of implementation, next year will be the last year, I think municipalities became so wired to this idea of performance criteria that it's actually going to be extremely hard to unmake to unmake in the so by of course you can unmake it, right? Like you can make a decision, you can take a decision and say, we're going to throw all this away. We're going to go back to doing things as usual. But I do believe that the administrators are so wired to these rigid things like performance criteria. How many people came? What did they ask for? Like it's a metric. It's a battery of 26 metrics that year after year they wrote report on. And so I think this has become ingrained in their way of doing business, and that even if these are if these are removed, there's a particular way of doing local governance that I think will remain at that level. And it will be interesting, again, to see what the administration, and how the administration, which I think is still going strong in Tunisia, will defend itself should these things disappear, and how this wiring of the administration will kind of continue. But I do not have empirical data about whether the World Bank is negotiating a new project or not. I do believe this was one of their most successful, by which I mean long-term local governance program in the region. This has been ongoing for 10 years, and it's a little over $500 million of lending in a country that doesn't have a big lending capacity, right? There's so much money you can give to Tunisia, and the fact that they kept giving to local government, there was demand for it, is proof.
Great. So we have one question from Pierre. Pierre would like to go ahead.
Hi. Yes, thank you. So I'll start with saying I know very little about Tunisia, but I was struck in the presentations that very few of you mention private sector of the economy, private actors who could sort of vote with their feet or their dollars or dinars on the particular ways in which the system is being reconstructed. And I'm also very curious about your take on the current vibe that, the world economy is falling apart. We're about to face a massive food shortage. The wheat prices are going to double, triple, or quadruple in the next couple of years if the Ukraine war doesn't end very soon, which seems to me is a very clear threat to any government anywhere in the MENA region in particular that used to depend on Russian and Ukrainian imports. So am I being unnecessarily pessimistic, or does the economy not really matter all that much?
Okay, Sarah, can you take this question? And there is another question in the audience that I will give to Dhia. So would you respond to Pierre's question about the economy issue?
Sure. I think the economy is absolutely crucial. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that, first of all, President Said does not have a team of economists that is able to handle the economic challenges facing Tunisia, even if he wanted to, but he has not made any real attempt at addressing the major challenges. You bring up the wheat prices. That's absolutely important. Tunisia imports the vast majority of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And so as this crisis continues, it's hurting many, many countries around the world, but Tunisia is one of them. And, this could be another area where we could see this as Said's undoing. The fact that I think, when we look at some of the hemorrhaging of public support from President Said, some of that is due to the fact that a lot of people who initially after July 25th sort of saw Said as someone who was taking the reins and maybe, in a way, their savior. He was going to fix the economy, the pandemic, as well as the political polarization, as over the past some months have shown that he hasn't done anything to improve the economy. And he doesn't even have a plan to improve the economy. He's so focused on changing the political system that I think a lot of people have started to wake up to the fact that he's not going to be the one that's going to solve the economic problems. And so a lot of the people who weren't necessarily loyal to him, they just liked that someone was doing something and he happened to be that person, are starting to see through him and are shifting their support away from him. So no, the economy plays a very important role in all of this.
Thanks, Sarah. Dhia, can you see the question from the panelists on the Tunisian economy?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, I can see it. So I would start by saying that I don't think that stability is the only factor that may explain the divergence between Tunisia and Morocco since 2011. There's a variety of other factors, including the authoritarian aspect of the regime, including the coordination capacity of the regime between different stakeholders. We do not have that in 2011. But answering to the question whether or not the current government or Said will be able to stabilize for a better living, I think that Said's problem is that he does not want to. He wants to govern the country without what he calls the intermediary bodies. He doesn't want to have NGOs or political parties or unions, and all these are institutions that were historically used by even authoritarian rulers to govern and control the masses. UGTT is not only an institution that has been used to organize protests, but also was an institution that bureaucratized labor-state relations and labor-business relations. And Said now is entering in the confrontation with them that has to do with his political choices as well as the economic ones. So I do not think that Said will be able to stabilize the country the way, I guess, the person who asked the question think of stability, simply because of the mode of governance of Said. In fact, we saw is that he's been expanding the role of the Ministry of Interior as a tool of governance and control. And Intissar mentioned the annexation of municipalities to the Ministry of Interior, but I heard from people from the Ministry of Commerce complaints about how Said has been deploying police to control prices and to control the circulations of goods in the commodity chain. Same thing regarding people from the Ministry of Finance. I've been complaining about the increased involvement of the Ministry of Interior in the in tax collection. So recently I think it was yesterday, a representative of the Association of Magistrates was talking about how the Ministry of Interior is surveying judges. So Said thinks that it's possible to stabilize the country with the Ministry of Interior. I don't think it's possible because the capacities of the Ministry of Interior, even if he wants to go back to an authoritarian regime, are significantly limited. And when it comes to social contestation, he may not have the support of the armed forces, whether the internal armed security forces or the defense forces in critical moments. And I remember, I think once I read in a footnote of Jean-Baptiste Galopin's doctoral dissertation on civil military relations about how Mohamed Ghannouchi once asked Rashid Ammar, how long can the country stand if we have an open general strike? And the answer was 48 hours. And I think it shows how it's impossible to rule the country with just the use of force.
Well, this is a great end for this roundtable and a very good concluding remark, Dhia. So I would like to thank all of you. We are sharp on time, and I'd like to thank all of you. It was really a pleasure to have all of you and hear your takes on the ongoing crisis in Tunisia. And we never know, maybe everything we said proves to be wrong next month with the referendum. We don't know. But thank you so much for your time. It was really a pleasure to see all of you again. Bye. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.